Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about assertive engagement in supportive housing. I'm Dawn Reinhardt Wood, and I'm joined by my colleague, Emily Bands, and we're from Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions, here in partnership with Washington DBHR. So we want to welcome you. Today's webinar is hosted by Washington DBHR through the Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive training, excuse me, and we encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout the session. The slides, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, will be sent via email after the presentation. So let's go ahead and look at some of the learning objectives that we hope that you'll take away after today's webinar. Today, we are going to be talking about assertive engagement and communication strategies. And we hope that you'll be able to identify critical time points, during the course of supportive housing services in which engagement may be a challenge. And there's going to be a point at which we ask you for some times that you've recognized as challenging times that we may not have included on the slides or thought to include because perhaps those situations didn't happen with us, right? So a lot of what we're going to be talking about not only comes from the research, but also personal experience. Both Emily and I have had a lot of experience in supportive housing before we hopped over to the academic side. So we also recognize that you're still doing this work, and we'd love to hear your experiences and maybe solutions if you have some. We also hope that you'll be able to explain some of the basic elements of a communication plan. We're going to be talking about primarily 3 or 4 main elements, which you may have heard before, but it's always good to talk about when we're talking about engagement, because big part of almost 99.9% of engagement is communication, right? And to be able to identify ways to cultivate goals and aspirations to encourage continued growth. So we also recognize that when people, who have struggled for a very long time and may have had a lot of adverse experiences during their journey that brought them to where you are in supportive housing, sometimes folks may think that they are happy or may legitimately be happy to just kind of rest for a while, right? We all need those periods of time, especially if we've endured a huge transition, stressful time, transformation, or we're struggling for a really long time. And now we find ourselves in a place where things feel okay, right? So it can be scary sometimes to take on additional goals, or we may not even be realizing what those goals or desires are. So we're going to spend also a little bit of time talking around that, around, trying to uncover goals that are, I don't want to say bigger, because it's really important to have housing and to have treatment and services and a support network, but things then that are a little higher on good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Beyond survival and moving into thriving mode. So those are the things that we're hoping you'll take away. So as I said earlier, communication is kind of the essence of engagement. We need to be able to recognize when individuals should be engaged. We don't always think about individuals who may be doing okay in our eyes, doing okay, right? They're in housing, maybe they're working part-time, maybe they're attending a treatment program. Maybe they're not calling you all the time, right? So as case managers, as outreach workers, as advocates, as peer supporters, we spend an awful lot of time with the people who are being vocal about their needs. And that might not be the majority of the individuals that we're serving, right? So we also need to think about those people, like what they are telling us when they are not communicating with us. And so with engagement, obviously we're going to talk about engagement and how to start to build a therapeutic rapport and some of the basic elements of that, but also this idea of creating expectation, creating something that this is a term I borrowed from clinical supervision and some of the clinical supervision consultation that we do with our state hospitals, but creating a cadence of accountability or expectations, right? So knowing when, as a tenant or as a recipient of services, when I can expect my service provider to engage with me, to reach out to me, to visit me, to call me. And also when you as the provider should be expecting input and contact from the individuals that you're serving. Because again, it's not a one-way street. Sometimes it may feel like that, but individuals also have to be able to come to the table, and perhaps we can nudge them along and try to help create this cadence of accountability and cadence of communication that becomes a bit more habitual for them so that they continue to maintain contact with you. And then we'll talk a little bit about also maintaining ongoing communication, but we'll revisit communication plans a little later towards the end of the training. But we just wanted to introduce this to you if you're wondering where the communication plan thing came from. So let's talk a little bit about why people don't engage. And you know what? Think about yourself also when we're going through this, times when maybe you're not as engaging with your peers, with friends, with colleagues, with providers that you may see. So reasons why people may choose not to engage or find themselves not being engaged or are perceived by their service providers as not being engaged. Sorry, let me take a sip of water. I'm a little dried out from allergy meds. Could be based in some reasons other than laziness. I think that, when I was working in supportive housing, I had a couple individuals that I worked with that it might be easy for me to just blame them, right? Because they were difficult, or I found them difficult to engage if I didn't kind of look at what some of the underlying issues may have been. So for some individuals, this may be lack of trust. When we think about individuals who transition into permanent supportive housing, think about a lot of the experiences that they may have had along that path, along that journey. Did they experience homelessness? When people are homeless, they are extremely vulnerable and very often are guarded because of that. People who are homeless are much more likely to be victimized and just be exposed to some potentially really terrible stuff. Additionally, individuals who may have spent time in and out of the mental health system of care, whether it be involuntary hospitalizations, which can really strain therapeutic rapport and trust for individuals and their care providers, those times, especially if folks aren't allowed to debrief after with those care providers once they've stabilized a little bit. Lack of therapeutic rapport, right? Does the individual, do they just kind of not have enough time in with you? Have they not, had the time to build that foundation that is built on trust, but also that ability to kind of be vulnerable, to ask for things, to advocate for themselves, to feel as if you're that safe and accepting person that would be able to meet them halfway when it comes to maybe some of their other goals that are beyond housing, beyond, seeing a psychiatrist, attending to therapy, maybe some of those other broader life rehabilitation goals. Maybe the comfort level isn't there just yet to talk about those issues, whether they be relationships or, going to work. A lot of people have had experiences in their lives where they were dissuaded from working because of having a disability or a psychiatric condition. And so we want to make sure that we're kind of laying that foundation and the sufficient time for people to realize that you're welcoming and you're able to talk to them about whatever their needs are. Trauma, I touched on that with the lack of trust, but people who are diagnosed with serious mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, kind of the schizophrenia spectrum of disorders, and major depressive disorder, also typically have a greater trauma load as well. And so we need to be keeping it at the forefront of our mind that trauma may be showing up in this as well, in terms of individuals, they may have made previous attempts at certain goals, and their mental health condition or other events that have happened in their life may have interrupted the pursuit of those goals. And that can be really upsetting. That can be really scary. Think about individuals who may have experienced the onset of a serious mental health condition as they were starting to, as they graduated high school and maybe were thinking about college or a career, only to have that set back. It can be scary to start to talk about kind of refocusing and looking at those goals again. We also are going to spend some time talking about, or this is one thing we're going to spend some time talking about in terms of the reasoning and how we can work with some of the reasons for the lack of engagement, is the theory of readiness. And is the individual in a readiness stage that you are matching with your interventions? So we'll talk about, things like mismatches, us coming at individuals, we're ready and we're in the action stage to work on a goal, and that individual may seem aloof or as if they're isolating or not really into it, because perhaps they do share this goal, but maybe they're not at the same readiness stage as we are to jump in and kind of like help them along the way. So we'll talk about readiness and matching interventions to the person's stage of readiness for change. And also this could be because of psychiatric symptoms. If you think about, psychotic symptoms, both positive and negative. So positive are those symptoms that the illness kind of adds that aren't usually there in a person that doesn't have a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. These are things like hallucinations, delusions. These types of things can make it uncomfortable for people to be around others. They may be self-conscious about it. They probably know that they're struggling with it, and maybe trying to mask those symptoms, which can be very, very exhausting. And this can also be the case for individuals who are experiencing anxiety and depression, depressive symptoms as well, with masking. And it just becomes very overwhelming for individuals to have to do that all day, every day. So they may pull back from you because they're exhausted. And in addition, individuals with negative symptoms, whether they be of psychotic disorders or mood disorders, those periods of isolation, periods of introversion, periods of low energy, real body fatigue and cognitive fatigue can also occur and, affect a person's level of engagement. So just the thing, not that anyone assumes this, but I know I made some of these assumptions or false attributions to people at points in my career, especially when I become frustrated, that lack of engagement is usually not laziness. That's not to say it's not sometimes laziness. People can have a mental condition and be lazy, right? People cannot have a mental condition and feel a little lazy, or I like to say unmotivated. I think lazy is very heavily loaded. And so I like to think about motivation, just be unmotivated around something. And so our goal is to try to motivate them enough, try to offer them the motivation we can, and be that positive force. So we just talked about some of those 5 common issues that may be contributing to lack of engagement. And let's talk a little bit about how you can then match what you think may be the issue. And, it doesn't hurt to hit all 5 of these as you're starting to engage with people, and specifically when you're working around maybe a goal that you see that perhaps the person has brought up in the past. Like maybe they said, oh, I want to, look into applying for college, or I want to get my GED, or I just want to get out and socialize more, right? And maybe that that goal has kind of gone away for a while. You haven't talked about it for a bit. And when you bring it up, people pull back. So let's look a little bit at what are some of those things that you can do, especially if you're not sure where that reason for the lack of engagement is. You can absolutely hit every single one of these as you're meeting with people. So when trust is an issue, what we need to recognize is that probably individuals have been let down by providers in the past. It may not be behavioral health care providers, may not be social services providers, might be family, right? And so like, if I can't trust my family, how can I trust you when you say you're going to help me with these really big life goals that I have? No one else has been able to help me. How are you going to help me, right? And we know that we're not in the business of, or we shouldn't be in the business of doing for people. But when folks are trying to trust that you're going to be an aid, that you're going to assist them, they're not going to want to hang their hopes on somebody if they've been let down repeatedly in the past. And we need to recognize that this does happen. It can happen as innocuously and with no malintent. If you just look at like the turnover that are in direct service jobs, right? I know here in New Jersey, turnover is very high in the community in terms of the professionals we have working in the field for a lot of reasons. And so individuals may fear trusting you with the expectation that you may not be here in 3 months or in the next year to even, be continuing to work on this goal with me. So the thing that we want to keep in mind is this idea of consistency, that if you say you're going to show up, if you say you're going to call, if you say you're going to be there for an activity with an individual, that you do it. Now, we know people get sick, things happen, pandemics happen. We've all kind of learned how to like roll with the punches the last few years and kind of figure out creative ways to do things, but as much as possible to be consistent. And when something disrupts that, to absolutely apologize, even if it's not your fault. I always like to lead with an apology. You have pneumonia, you didn't ask for that, but apologize, right? Because it is helpful in building trust and showing the person that you actually consider that it is hard for them to trust. And the one thing that when I was a director in supportive housing that I always told my staff was to underpromise and overdeliver. People may come to us with so many problems that we want to help them solve, things that we know that we can help fix, right? But underpromise and overdeliver. Reassure, but don't promise. And I find that when we come through with things consistently and often over deliver, that really does help to build that trust. Therapeutic rapport. So may simply be an issue of that therapeutic rapport hasn't had enough time, depending on the person's own personal characteristics, their experiences, maybe how recent they are in terms of enrolling in services in your program. The therapeutic rapport may not be there yet. And it may be, there may be these other factors like trust, trauma, readiness, psychiatric symptoms that may also influence the development of that therapeutic rapport. So some of the most effective things that a provider can do is to be non-judgmental, number one, about the person, how they present themselves, their history, what they're bringing with them, but also where they are at right now, right? Like not expecting them to be doing the things that maybe client B is also doing, right? Because everybody is unique. And so trying to move at their pace, letting them lead in terms of where they are in their stages of change and their readiness to make changes in their life, being welcoming and also being culturally aware. So understanding that there may also be cultural aspects to how an individual interfaces with professionals in general especially in that broader spectrum of the medical community within which we do find ourselves, right? Some individuals may expect you to take the lead, especially from certain cultures. And so it's really important to spend that time in developing that rapport and the expectations that the person should have of you and that you have of them in a more psychiatric rehabilitation focused type program like supportive housing. We have to ask about trauma. So sometimes we don't do the best job at asking questions about trauma. We're like, were you ever traumatized? Well, what some people think is trauma, other people don't, and vice versa. And so we want to ask questions about significant events in the individual's lives that have impacted them in an adverse way, right? So like I said earlier, did they begin to experience the onset of their psychiatric symptoms during a time when so many of us are starting to explore what it is to be an adult, right? And to develop relationships, to explore education, to explore vocational opportunities, to find ourselves. Many people may be finding themselves in terms of their likes, their dislikes now at a later point than maybe some of the rest of us had that opportunity to do. So, and also, like, has the system hurt them? People who experience involuntary hospitalizations, involuntary holds, psychiatric commitments, they experience the stripping away of their civil rights, at least to a certain extent, to a great extent. That can be harmful to a person. And so we have to also acknowledge how they have had a lot of their agency stripped away from them. And that is like their ability to make effective changes in areas of their life that they see as problematic, or they just see that they want to strengthen. So the system, unfortunately, tends to condition people into a state of learned helplessness, especially folks who have spent time institutionalized, incarcerated, and so forth. We talked about readiness stage to an extent. So, but like if the person behaviorally and cognitively ready to make changes or start to work on goals, as we said earlier, the person may have just gone through a really big move. Maybe they just transitioned from homelessness to housing, from institutional setting to housing. That in and of itself is a lot. I moved a couple years ago from a house to an apartment. It took me like a week to kind of recover, and I still have things in boxes. So in some ways I'm still recovering. So let's remember that like huge life events like that can maybe lead to some people needing to press pause for a little bit, and that's okay. We just don't want people to get stuck. And then psychiatric symptoms. Talked a lot about that on the previous slide, so I'm not going to go any more into that at this point, but those symptoms can affect an individual's outward behavior and their ability to engage with others. If you've ever felt, and I'm not comparing temporary periods of sadness to full-blown depressive episode, but there are times when we don't want to be bothered. There are times when additional input from outside of ourselves is overwhelming stimuli, right? And so like we need to also be mindful about that and kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what the individual is experiencing psychiatrically. And hopefully you have the rapport with them to be able to ask those questions about mood-related symptoms, anxiety, any kind of psychotic symptoms. And so, hearing all that, like what are some of the times that we do see people tend to disengage? Some of my musings and things that I have observed is that after move-ins, like there might be this initial burst of like helping an individual get set up, maybe going through checking on like, doing some skills building work, helping them with the setup, helping get them oriented to their community, maybe linked up with mental health providers or support groups or drop-in centers and these sorts of things. And then that may die off a little bit. And that seems to be pretty natural. I've seen that a lot. And I think simply people are tired, right? They just went through a lot and probably mustered a lot of psychic and physical energy to get through that move. And it's okay to back off a little bit, but you probably still want to have a communication plan so they expect to know when you're going to be in communication. Periods of stability. So the person is like kind of flying along and maybe feels as if they don't quite need you the way they may have needed you 7 months ago when they just transitioned from homelessness to housing, right? So they don't want you to kind of disrupt the apple cart. Or if it took them a while, if they were experiencing a lot of psychiatric symptoms and now those symptoms seem to have abated, it can be really stressful at times to think about taking on a new challenge or meeting a requirement to sit down and review your recovery plan or your treatment plan. That may feel heavy to people, and so they just don't want to disrupt. They may not want to revisit certain things because they're feeling okay right now. So it's kind of like, leave me alone, let me be. And also flowing into good times, right? The person is maybe working, maybe they have a relationship, they got a dog, all things are good, right? But you still have certain things that you need to do with them. In terms of them remaining in the program, in terms of them continuing to work on goals to strengthen their coping skills, to achieve goals that perhaps they have mentioned before. And so we can see it happen during good times. And during challenging times. We talked earlier about people's psychiatric symptoms, perhaps folks wanting to mask those symptoms. I don't want you to see me crying. I'm too scared to meet with you right now because my anxiety is heightened. And that, that can be ameliorated with continuing to strengthen that therapeutic rapport and encouraging the person to be vulnerable, at least with you, around some of those issues when they're starting to feel them, experience them. Do the folks that are here have any other times where they see people kind of step away or pull back? Any experiences that you've had? Feel free to share or ask and we can give you the microphone. What about you, Emily? Have you seen any others?
Oh, I also, when people are doing something that they think that you will think is wrong.
Naughty?
Yeah, when they're doing something
Yeah,
bad. So
that's a really good point. I should have brought that up. Yeah. So like if they're maybe using, or maybe they have people staying in their residence that aren't on the lease. I can't believe I didn't remember that one because that happened a lot when I was working in supportive housing. But yeah, something that they think you may judge them about or may quote unquote get them in trouble, may jeopardize their lease, right? And when people are struggling, we want them to be able to be honest with us. So I think that's excellent to bring that up. Let's see. Sorry, Kelsey. Zoom is tricky like that. So we have a couple of comments. Christina said when the program is reaching an outside set end date, for example, when their temporary housing is almost at an end, particularly if permanent housing isn't looking likely, right? So kind of almost like avoiding that inevitable and avoiding those scary things. Absolutely. And maybe if we don't have contact, maybe, I won't end up needing to move on. I don't know. I'm assuming there's a lot of thoughts that could be there. We have disengagement when clients finally get housing opportunities after waiting a long time. Yeah, absolutely. So, we talked about that like after move-in. Okay, now I'm in. I don't, almost like this, it feels like, oh, I don't want to be bothered with you anymore. I got the housing, I'm in. And so reminding people also that this program isn't just about housing, right? Like housing is like, I don't want to say the easy part because it's definitely not easy, but once you get it, that housing is there, right? The really hard part is working towards those rehabilitation goals, putting that work in. Housing is the foundation of that and the container for that, but absolutely. So a lot of people, so starting college, yeah, people having a lot of responsibilities and also, you know, taking on a lot of responsibilities and being afraid that we might judge them because maybe they're not managing those responsibilities. Fear of change, yeah, we're all scared about that, right? Have you ever changed jobs? Have you ever ended a relationship? Have you ever, like, oh, we could go on forever and ever about have you ever. That stuff is really scary. And think about the issues that the individuals that we're serving may be wrestling with in terms of homelessness, trauma, maybe not having the best support system. Ah, yes, disengaging when success is in the future, in the near future, the fear of being housed, so avoiding service providers. So are you talking like individuals who may be experiencing homelessness or institutionalization, Carson? And then that move to housing is really scary. We see this in the state psychiatric hospitals. We're trying to do a lot of work around discharge hesitancy. And I experienced it, Emily experienced it as supportive housing providers. We would get referrals from our state psychiatric hospitals. Person has been stable for months, maybe years. And around the time that referrals start to be made to housing, you start to see an explosion sometimes of sabotaging behaviors, or just, I don't want to talk to you, I'm going to refuse discharge. And they have a right to refuse discharge. So Kelsey also said, having had clients go from homelessness into housing, and then after a bit, starting to talk about leaving because of small frustrations. Yeah, like a neighbor ignoring them or not liking how the landlord mows. Wow, I never heard that one, but absolutely, like things that we would think of as, wow, you were just living on the streets, right? And now you're in this apartment and you feel safe. But like some of the things that we don't think about are some of the coping strategies that people come up with and create, which are really, really amazing when they are living in vulnerable situations, like in homelessness, or when they are doubled and tripled up with other people. I call it couch surfing, or when they are institutionalized in a hospital or a prison setting, jail setting, right? They've made a lot of adaptations to their behavior to feel safe. And some of that may go hand in hand with isolating, with distancing from other people. And it takes some time to figure out then who and what is safe in this new environment. Because remember, they figured out how to stay safe in a completely different environment. Think about like the veteran, the combat veteran returning home, right? Like my father was a Vietnam vet. He bragged that he never fired his rifle at a human being. He did say he shot at some kind of big cat at one point. But he prided himself on, I never fired my rifle at a human being when I was in the war. When he came home, he slept with a pistol under his pillow for 3 years, right? He didn't feel safe at home, which is wild to think of, but yes. Okay, so thank you for that. That was great. I knew we'd get some really great responses that we didn't think of. Okay, Emily?
Yeah. So I think Dawn and all of us really had a good discussion about some of these external factors that can contribute to somebody disengaging. But when we think of this idea of disengagement traps, we're really thinking about what we're bringing to the session as the provider or as the staff person working with the person. So I don't know if anybody here has heard of disengagement traps. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but I did just want to highlight a few of them. So I think blaming is the first one I want to highlight, because I think this is something we kind of touched upon with some of this external stuff, right? So when somebody is feeling like They're disengaging because they, don't want to be judged, or they don't want to get in trouble, right? Maybe it's because in the past there was a situation where they felt like the finger was being pointed at them, right? Looking at this idea of the expert. I think this is a common disengagement trap that a lot of us can very easily fall into. And again, not anything intentional, not anything to, um, you know, uh, harm the individual we're working with, right? Because at the end of the day, when you're providing services to somebody, there is a power differential there. It's very clear that power differential is happening. But when you're setting up a clear, uneven power relationship and coming off in a sense of I know all, or I know everything, or I am the expert in the situation, that's something that could potentially be a little off-putting for people and also impact the trust that you've built with them. The other thing I want to focus on is the chat. And I think this is also something that is very, very easy to fall into, not something that we want to, not something that we're doing again to cause harm to the individual that we're working with, but just kind of having a lot of that small talk conversation, right? And I think, and you guys let me know if this is something that you do, because I know this is something that I would always do with individuals, especially when I first started meeting with them, right? Sometimes you have some of that small talk conversation because you're trying to get to know them. You're trying to figure out who they are, what they are looking to get out of the program, what their needs are, what their strengths are. You're having some of these conversations that feel more friendly. And then that can be very confusing to somebody when you then have to set boundaries with them, because it's not a friendship that you're engaging in, right? It is a therapeutic relationship. It is a staff person consumer relationship. And then the last one I want to highlight is premature focus. And that's when you're coming into the session and you're focusing on a topic that you feel is the priority, but maybe isn't something that the individual you're working with feels like a priority. And this was something that would always happen for me when I was working in the field. I was a manager of the program, and I was working in a building that my organization owned. So for me, there were times where I was going out to meet with somebody, and I had to address like a housing issue, and it was my responsibility to do so. And I was making that the priority because I had to, but that wasn't what the individual's priority was. Like, they wanted to meet with me for something different. And that was something that could have, luckily it didn't, or most of the time it didn't, but that was something that very much could have impacted our relationship, our therapeutic relationship. As you all are reading over these disengagement traps, is there anything that really stands out to you? Anything that you feel like you've fallen into unintentionally? What are your guys' thoughts?
I would say like what you were saying about premature focus, um, but that idea of how so often people who are supportive housing professionals find themselves in that balancing act of being, well, everything. And that's why I often call people in supportive housing superheroes. SH doesn't just stand for supportive housing, it stands for superheroes. Because it takes a lot of skill to strike that balance of being a mediator, being an intermediary for the client, for the tenant and the landlord, and very often other external entities, whether they're Section 8 or some other kind of housing entity or service provider, and then being able to balance that with the therapeutic aspects of the job can be really difficult, right?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of time where we are put in, I don't know if uncomfortable is the right word, but just like that, almost like a contentious position where we have to abide by the state regulations, the regulations under the voucher, the regulations under the services, our organization's policies and procedures. And oftentimes we go out there And we have to, ask them, well, I want to talk with you about this, but your lights are about to be turned off, or you didn't pay your rent, so now you're going to be evicted, right? But the person wants to talk about something else or wants to focus on something else. It's so hard to balance that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I see Christina said we can occasionally focus so much on our client that we forget the reality of helping the family, not just the main person on our agenda. Just because our client is in one phase doesn't mean that the whole family is in the same place, right? So, when you're also serving non-single individuals,
Mhm.
um, that context has to absolutely be considered.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And, there may also be family members. Family can be a blessing and sometimes not so much. Great. We all know this,
Mhm.
personally and professionally, that, not all family has the best intentions either. And so, um, also knowing that like a person can be getting a lot of overwhelming input and opinions from a lot of entities. So like being there, being present, being accepting for them, and allowing them to express what they want is
Mhm.
so important. So we're going to talk a little bit about continuing to go into engagement and communication. But what I want you to start to do is to start to think about, for the individuals that you're serving, that maybe you're having a difficult time in terms of maintaining engagement with them. Maybe they seem to be dodging you a little bit. It's like I had people that I used to sometimes, if I had a slow day, like if I had, I don't know, this always happened to me. I'd either have really, really ridiculously busy days, or every single person would cancel on me and I'd have nothing to do. Well, not nothing to do. There's always paperwork, right? But like sometimes I would take those days and me and another case manager would like go out and literally try to hunt people down. Like it was, okay, the person frequents this area. This is the corner shop they like to go to. This is the library they like to go to. This is their little nail salon. I'm going to go to all those places. I'm going to go drink coffee at that Dunkin' Donuts and see if it, and I'm not saying you have the time to do this, but like when you have those people that you're like finding yourself kind of chasing, um, start to think about like when communication has worked with you, was there some sort of day, time, place where it seemed to facilitate, more engagement, more communication? So start to think about like, you know, like the person that you need to engage with, the frequency that you think might help, the frequency that they say might be helpful to them. Um, how, is it that you're meeting in their home? Is it that you're meeting at a park? Is it that you're meeting at Starbucks? I would say Dunkin' Donuts if we're over here on the East Coast, but Starbucks. Is it if you're, like those kinds of things, like thinking about how that's going to happen. And then also, what happens when there's a real emergency, a true emergency, and what those emergency contact procedures look like. So again, establishing a communication plan that we are definitely going to stand by, that's doable for us. So don't create one that's not going to be doable with the individual that you're working with, but making sure that they are assured that when you need to be there, you will be there. And when they need to get a hold of you, even if they've been out of contact with you, that they can. So continuing to build that trust, that rapport, and to build that, again, the cadence of accountability, that they know that they should have the expectation that every 2 weeks on Wednesday at 3 p.m., you guys are going to meet, right? I'm not saying that's going to fix things overnight, but creating like that habit, it takes a little bit of time. Okay.
I'm going to switch over to share, Dawn.
Okay, no problem.
So, how do we communicate, right? What comes into this realm of communication? And we wanted to give you some information. This very much might be information that you know, it might be more of a refresher, but we wanted to talk a little bit about nonverbal and verbal communication, right? And I think, again, if this is something that you've seen before, and isn't necessarily new information, I always like to review this because I think sometimes it's very easy to forget how important this verbal and nonverbal communication can be at the times when we're meeting with somebody. So the first thing we're going to go over is SOLAR, and SOLAR is an acronym for nonverbal communication skills. So SOLAR stands for square, open, lean in, eye contact, and relax. Right? So when you're having a conversation with somebody, when you're meeting with somebody, you want to make sure that your body is positioned square to them. So kind of a little bit off to the side of them, right? You want to make sure that your body language and that your posture is open. If you're sitting, you want to make sure you're leaning in a little bit to that person. You want to make sure that you're maintaining eye contact. And then you want to make sure that you're relaxed during the conversation. A lot of the times, especially when we're having, I'm going to ask a question actually instead of talking. So how many of you have had an outreach with somebody and maybe they're feeling overwhelmed or they're feeling upset and they're feeling frustrated, and you could tell that their energy is high. You can tell that their energy is just very angry, very annoyed, not in a good place. And you come in and you're calm, you're relaxed, your tone of voice is low. Has anybody ever seen a shift in that conversation at a time when that happens? And you can just type yes in this. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So this can be so good in those types of situations, but also good in any other kind of situation where you're communicating with somebody, right? Because it's showing the person that you're paying attention and it's showing the person that you're engaged, right? I know. Yeah, Dawn.
No, go ahead, finish your thought, and I just have an interjection.
Well, so I know a lot of you probably are using like a laptop sometimes, or maybe using a cell phone. I know for us in New Jersey, part of doing our documentation is a lot of the providers will use a computer in front of them because of the way that our documentation system is, that I'm not going to get into. But it can be hard. We've heard a lot of feedback from our providers in New Jersey that's sometimes just being able to do some of the being squared, making sure we're keeping that eye contact, making sure we're staying open and relaxed, helps the person feel like you're paying attention when often they don't feel like you are because you're in front of the computer. What were you going to say though, Dawn?
Well, I saw, and I'm sorry, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, Tasha or Tasia. Your hand was up, so I gave you the mic if you'd like to speak. If it was a mistake, that's okay. Just let me know. You're not being forced to speak. I don't hear them, so maybe it was an accident. What I also wanted to say, and if they come on, that's fine. And I'll be quiet. What
I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
You said Tasha, who's my
Hi.
colleague, but I'm not Tasha. But since I'm on and it apparently was an accident. This is so great that you did solar, because I am in a counseling techniques class and we just went over this. And that was the first thing I thought about, is they're always asking us to do collaborative documentation with clients. How do you sit at a computer and also attend to the client in this very way? And that's exactly what you were getting at, Emily and Dawn. How do you do that technique? It would be very difficult. I feel.
We can definitely talk about that. Absolutely. It's such an excellent point. And I think a lot of organizations grapple with that, right? Especially in the beginning. I know that we had these little mini laptop books, and even that, it was still awkward and felt like there was this barrier then, even though you were face to face with people. The one thing that I wanted to say about coming into a situation when people are in a heightened state of anxiety, anger, fear, whatever it is. Some folks find it very difficult to regulate their emotions, right? So there's this thing, I really don't like the word that much, but this phrase, emotional dysregulation. But like a lot of folks, especially folks with trauma histories, may have a very hard time regulating their emotions. By seeing you, if they're in an upset state, they see you in a calm state, it actually helps them to regulate their emotions by mirroring you, right? And so one of the things that I know that I remind staff in the psychiatric hospital so often is that when you're responding to a psychiatric code, which is usually when an individual may need to be restrained or something like that, and people are yelling and screaming, don't be the 15th person that comes onto the scene yelling and screaming.
Right.
It only heightens the anxiety, right? We know what it feels like to be in that kind of environment. So that's another thing that, like, keep in mind that try to reflect or put out an affect, the desired affect that you want the individual to at some point be able to attain during that visit, right? So I'm sorry, Emily, I just wanted to interject those 2 cents.
No, you bring up a really good point, Dawn, because I mean, think about it, right? If you, I just imagine myself like being in a store and somebody starts yelling and screaming, and I'm like, what is happening? And then, I'm already now feeling heightened and frustrated, right? So you're 100% correct, right? Being able to have that calm, relaxed presence can help the person to almost fight what they're feeling internally, because they have a visual representation in front of them, like, oh, okay, she's okay, she's calm, maybe that's something I can do. But Denise put something in the chat that I do want to mention. So Denise said, you have to think about furniture seating arrangement. I had a doctor that had his exam table in one corner and his computer in the opposite corner. He had his back to his patients the entire appointment so he could type. Do you know, I love those types of appointments, Denise. Just kidding. I hate those types of appointments. Because it's so dismissive, right? They're asking you all these very intimate, important questions, and they're just not even facing you, right? So I think the positioning of where you are very much can be helpful. And that was actually going to be my suggestion, was something that I would always recommend to my staff when doing concurrent documentation is to have the person sit next to you. Just have them sit right next to you, right? And then if you're worried about HIPAA, don't open up your EHR, right? Just open up a blank Word document or a Google Doc or whatever, type of word processing system you're using, right? But just open up a blank Google Doc or Word document and use that to then document the session, and then copy and paste it over into your electronic health record later. The other thing I always recommend to individuals when doing concurrent documentation is save it to the end. So I would always recommend that my staff would take like 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes at the end, and ask the person to summarize what happened in the session, and what they thought was really great about the session and what wasn't so great about the session. And then I would sit there, or my staff would sit there and then type things out. But I think the positioning of where you are, and this is also not going to be a perfect solution, right? Because you can't always do this. But there were plenty of times where I was in somebody's apartment and we were sitting on a couch next to each other, or we were sitting at their kitchen table next to each other. And it didn't feel so dismissive of my body language. So I hope that kind of clarifies that. And again, when you're having these conversations, trying your best to do some or all of these components of solar. I think eye contact is a really big one, right? Because I'm sure a lot of you have had conversations with friends, family members, spouses. You're having a conversation with them and you see their eyes look away and you see them go into their own thoughts, and they're not paying attention anymore, right? So just being able to maintain that eye contact and be facing them in a squared way, leaning in, using some of those other nonverbal facial expressions, right? So I didn't get to ask this question yet, but what other types of nonverbal communication do you use? I'm a big facial expression gal, when appropriate, right? So if someone says something to me and I'm shocked, I'm sad, I am annoyed, I use my eyes, right? I use my hands, as I'm sure you all can see. But what other types of nonverbal communication do all of you use when you're communicating with somebody?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, Emily, for me, it's the hands. I think being East Coasters, we're
Karate chopping.
track between New York City and Philly where we're doing the karate all over the place. But like I would do a lot of like thumbs up and peace, like we would, like if we were onto something, I'd be like, yes, like we're onto it. And I had a couple of my clients who would like do that too. They would mimic me. So that was, sometimes you create your own language. Let's see, in the chat we have nodding. Absolutely. Nodding.
As I stand here nodding. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Even something like I don't know, even something like a smile, I think can also be kind of affirming to people. So really paying attention of how you're using nonverbal communication to in positive ways where you're trying to be affirming and reflective of what the person is saying, and then also being mindful of your nonverbal communication, because again, you always want to make sure it's when it's appropriate, right? There were a lot of times where I had clients who were making choices that I did not think were the best choices.
No, that
No, sometimes, no, not a lot. But when that happened, I was very, very mindful of my facial expressions, because I didn't want to come off that I was being judgmental or that I wasn't in agreement, because at the end of the day, it was their choice. And good, I'm happy that Dawn's comment helped you to think more about mirroring and how that can help engagement. So in keeping it moving, I also want to talk about OARS. And OARS is an acronym of 4 verbal engagement strategies within the realm of motivational interviewing. So again, something that I'm sure many of you have probably heard of, but I did just want to bring this to the table, right? So first and foremost, open-ended questions. Making sure that when we're asking questions, which you're going to at some point have to, but making sure that they are open-ended questions. And I wish I could say that 10 years later, I still did not ask a closed-ended question, but I ask them all the time, right? Because sometimes you have to ask closed-ended questions. So just to let you know, Lori, the slides and the recording are going to be sent out after the session. So no worries. But sometimes you do have to ask closed-ended questions, right? But you want to make sure that you're having that balance. There's not a specific formula of I'm going to ask 5 open-ended, I'm going to ask 5 closed-ended questions. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. But you do want to, within your mind, just be mindful of how many closed-ended questions you're asking, because it can then feel like an interrogation. And we don't want the person to feel like that. Right? So you want to make sure that when you're asking open-ended questions, you're saying something like, well, why don't you tell me about this? Right? Instead of asking, what did you do? Or what happened? Right? Tell me about what happened. Tell me about what you felt during that situation. Right? You also want to make sure you're using those affirmations. You want to make sure that you're recognizing the person's experience, right? Letting them know, like, hey, you did a really great job communicating with that with the cashier. I know you were really nervous about coming to the store today and having to talk to the cashier and give them the money. You did a really great job doing that, right? You also want to make sure that you're using your reflections, right? So you want to acknowledge the content of what they're saying, and you want to acknowledge what they're feeling, right? So Dawn, you felt frustrated. Or Dawn, it sounds like you had a really challenging time as a manager of supportive housing program. Right. But you want to use those reflections to show the person that you recognize and acknowledge and understand what they're saying. And then finally, summarizing. And I think for me, summarizing is my favorite. Because it just kind of brings it all in, just kind of lassos everything in. And again, it's really great to use summarization at the end of the session and ask the person to summarize and say, hey, so what do you think about today's session? Tell me about what was great about today's session. Tell me about what we did. Tell me about what we could have done differently. And that is the information that you can then use for your progress note.
I love the idea, and Emily, I didn't think about it until you just said it like that. But that idea of having, like, obviously us summarizing is important to make sure we got it all right.
Mhm.
But that idea of having the individuals summarize what you did that day during that session, I think is great. I love that because I think it draws them in even more. And obviously like helps make sure that you got it right and you're on the same page. That's great.
Absolutely. Has anyone here ever met with somebody and you think you had like a really great, fantastic session? You think that they, absorbed all the information and everything made sense, and you gave them homework and you're like, okay, yeah, this is great. And then you come back and meet with them again and it's like, oh, I don't remember what happened. Oh my God, yes. Yeah. So what I found was having the person summarize at the end helped me to know that they got the good, like, not that there are good parts and bad parts of the session, but the most important parts of the session, right? So if their homework was to go pay their electric bill, right? And I'm asking them to summarize and they're saying all this other stuff and they're not mentioning the electric bill, red flag for me, right? And now I know I need to say, oh, and yeah, and we also spent a lot of time talking about your electricity and making sure that it stays on. And and oh yeah, I have to pay my electric bill. Right. So it almost can be like a cue for them to really be able to process and think about the session. Um,
Yeah, and people are saying some really great things.
mhm,
Like Diana gives notes and then
right.
take with them and then follow up about it.
Mhm,
Tina says, I have them write down on a sticky note what their homework is. I had an individual who we would do the sticky note thing
mhm.
and he would put it on his refrigerator.
Yeah.
So that every single time he went back to his refrigerator, he would see like, pay the
Mhm,
electric bill on Tuesday, or
right.
call my case manager on when, like these kinds of things. I think that those are great ideas because we also need to remember that a lot of the behavioral health conditions that people experience
Impact memory.
do impact memory and people's cognitions,
Yep.
right? So it can be easy for any one of us without a serious mental health condition to become overwhelmed and like forget things. I do it all the time.
Yep.
Um, and so like, knowing that people with these specific diagnosed conditions also have associated cognitive impacts, it's
Right.
really great that you're using those prompts for
Mhm.
them.
Yeah.
Bravo.
The other thing I can recommend, which is similar to having people write things down, but if somebody doesn't have um, strong reading or writing abilities, um, something that, and I think this is pretty accessible now, is to have them make a voice recording as a reminder. And I had one client who did he I think his highest grade level was like fifth grade. So he had very low literacy and very low writing skills. And we would have him make voice memos for himself. And that was a way for him to help him remember the different things he had to do because he couldn't write them down. So that's also something that might be helpful for all you guys. It's also important when thinking about communication, though, to think about communication and cultural differences, right? So, culture definitely impacts our use and understanding of communication, right? So, very big thing I'll say is talking with my hands, right? I'm a very much a hand talker. I think it has to do with the culture of the East Coast. I think it has to do specifically with the culture of New Jersey. But for me, I am Italian. I will say that, and that is something that I've noticed a lot of people in my family also do. We talk with our hands, but this could potentially be very offensive to somebody because again, I'm using very fast hand gestures, and they don't know what's happening, right? So I tend to do it when I'm presenting, but when I'm meeting with my clients, I almost have to sit on my hands sometimes because I have to be very mindful about the different hand movements and hand gestures that I'm using. And that's nonverbal communication, right? So again, when we're looking at this, we're thinking about verbal and nonverbal communication. So when we're looking at this idea of emotional expressiveness, right? Facial expressions, some facial expressions, depending on the person's culture, it could be something that's very accepting. They might um, be able to use your facial expressions as like a marker for what you're saying. But for other cultures, they might be put off by it. Eye contact, right? Some cultures are very, very big on eye contact. Some cultures are not big on eye contact. Uses of pauses or silences, facial expressions. Because again, I think emotional expressiveness is not necessarily just facial expressions, right? It could also be just expressing any type of emotions, openly expressing sadness, openly expressing anger. So I do just want to clarify that. The formality, right? I had some clients who were much more laid back and very open to have me in their home. And I had other clients who would only meet with me in my office because it was a much more formal relationship and experience for them. And then directness. So what I do want to ask, has anybody ever had a cultural misunderstanding with anybody that they've worked with?
I had one in terms of, I guess it would be directness,
Mm,
maybe. And it looks like Denise is hopping onto this thought as well. It's very consistent with that. Like the individual that I'm working with being to what I thought, my impression was inordinately passive,
right.
much more passive than even I've seen with, I hate to say my typical average run of the mill supportive housing
Mm-hmm.
client that can tend to be really passive because of how they've been kind of juggled around in the mental health system. But it was because they gave deference and they put professionals kind of on, like on a pedestal in a way.
Yeah.
You know best, so you
For
tell me what to do, and that's really hard when we're trying to empower people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Uh,
this idea of agreeing out of politeness, right? Just yesing you. And I think it can also become, I felt frustrated by situations like these, but we'd have a conversation and then they would agree out of that idea of politeness or that idea of like, yes, Emily, you're the professional, you're the program manager, yes. And then I would come back and meet with them and say, okay, how did that thing go? Oh, I didn't do it. Because they didn't want to do it. They just didn't want to. That's not the path they wanted to take. So it was hard to navigate those situations because internally I'm like, then just say no, you don't have to. But it was hard for them to make that choice and openly make that decision for themselves. And yeah, being direct. There are some times where people can find direct communication as aggressive, which is not the case, right? I think so. That is something that is incredibly challenging. Lamont, you said yes, in some cultures, eye contact can be seen as insulting, and I'm accustomed to strong eye contact. I have to remind myself to avoid eye contact at times, right? And something that can be helpful when you are first meeting with individuals, and we're going to get into this idea of a communication plan in a little bit, but having some open conversations about culture and how culture impacts communication, and what the individuals you're working with, what they see as an ideal communication method from you, right? So asking like, hey, we talked about your culture or your religion last time. How do you think that impacts your communication? My culture, this is how we communicate. How would you prefer for me to communicate with you? And just kind of opening the door, because I think one, sometimes people feel uncomfortable having that conversation. And I think two, sometimes people don't necessarily see how much their culture can impact how they communicate because it's their culture. They're around people who are like them, who are of the same culture of them all the time. So they see everybody communicating in the same way. It isn't until they start communicating with somebody different that it's like, oh, no, I didn't know nobody else did this, right? So it's important to kind of open up the dialogue to have these conversations. And then for you, Christina, you said your age. So you said, assuming my youth is inexperienced, lack of knowledge, You look even younger than you are. You've emphasized your stage of life, married parent, to make yourself seem more approachable and knowledgeable for client comfort. Yeah. And that's a huge one. And I can definitely identify that personally. When I started working in the field, I was like 22.
Oh, yeah, I was told off many times for being young, a little girl. That's the thing.
Mhm.
Little girl, you don't know what
Young
you're
lady.
about. Young
Yes,
lady.
young lady. Yeah. And it can be, it can be challenging, right? It's almost like you have to prove yourself. But it sounds like you've come up with ways that I'm hoping that you're, comfortable with, Christina. I know sometimes um, it can be hard to determine whether or not you want to share personal information or how much personal information to share. But I hope that you've come up with a way that you feel comfortable with to help people, understand and recognize that you're, I was going to say age ain't nothing but a number, but we're not going to go down that way. That, just because you are maybe of a certain age group or you look younger than what you actually are, it doesn't necessarily impact your ability to, provide services and help somebody. But thank you for sharing that, Christina. So when thinking of this idea of developing a communication plan, Denise. So I do want to just highlight this for a second, Denise, because you do bring up a really good point. So 100% gender role expectations, and a lot of cultures dictate very specific gender role expectations. And that is definitely something that can impact communication. So yes, thank you for bringing that up.
So the one person that I ever encountered in my service in supportive housing that I literally had to put my time out, I had to put myself in a corner in terms of interacting with this client because he was very misogynistic and just outright disrespectful of the women who worked in our program. And I literally had one of my male staff members say to me, I got him from now on because you're probably going to lose your job if you continue to interact with him. And it was like, seriously, like recognizing our own triggers, right? Like even sometimes we need to be aware. This guy was in the wrong. He was absolutely in the wrong. At the same time, he was our client, right? And so like that can be absolutely challenging, where people may have certain roles about what you're supposed to do for them. Or, kind of, yes. And knowing your own triggers is super important.
And also, when you can, bumping it to your supervisor. I had one client who had very specific gender role expectations around the therapeutic relationship. And we were, a majority of the time I was working in the program I was working with, we didn't have male staff. So he would only work with me because I was the supervisor and I was of that place of power. And it was, I did it, right? Because I was the supervisor, I was the manager, and there was no sense in trying to have my staff continue to meet with him when he was reluctant to it. He wasn't getting any help. He wasn't getting the help he needed, right? So 100%, Dawn, understanding your triggers and then getting support and getting extra help when needed. Because sometimes these things are just going to happen and you have to, figure out how to navigate the situation. Yeah. Oh, so moving on to this idea of a communication plan. So we wanted to talk about developing a communication plan because a communication plan is something that can help you to support the consumer in navigating their independence, but also staying in touch with your organization. Right? Because when we're thinking about some of those times, thinking back to what Dawn was talking about earlier, of some of those times when people disengage and they kind of go off the radar, it's because they're exploring their independence, right? Someone mentioned they got a job, or maybe they're in school, or maybe they just moved into their apartment and they're enjoying it, right? So they are trying to be independent. They're trying to enjoy their life, right? Especially if this is somebody who was unhoused, if this was somebody who was living in the state hospital, right? The people that we're working with have had experiences where they've been unable to make the choices that they want to make and now they're in their own apartment and they can do what they want, literally. So for a lot of reasons, I don't blame them for not wanting to talk to me or see me, because they're just trying to live their life, right? But there has to be that level of, yes, I want you to live your life and I support that, but you also have to stay in touch with me. How do we make that happen? Okay. And a communication plan, it doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be something that's even written down unless the person needs it to remember, right? But it's just thinking about some of these factors. So when you're developing a communication plan, these are just some things to consider. Okay. So how often do you have to be in communication? Okay. So how often are you going to be in communication the first week? Right. And maybe the first week it's a little bit less, or maybe it's a little bit more. And then maybe the second week it's a little bit less or more. Right. Are you communicating on a specific day and time? Okay. What could potentially impact the consumer's ability to communicate with you? Are they having issues with paying their bills? Is there an issue with them being able to remember to charge their cell phone? Do they need to set an alarm to remember to call you on that specific day or time? And then what's the plan for when you inevitably miss the proposed day and time, right? Because stuff happens. Maybe you're getting caught up and you miss their phone call, or maybe they're doing something and they miss your phone call, right? So how do you kind of navigate that? And again, this is something that can be very informal, something that isn't written down rule or a policy or anything like that, but just a plan to help keep that line of communication open. Does anybody out there have a type of communication plan, or do you guys find that during these times of disengagement that communication can be really challenging?
So one of the things that I used to do was I would have a day of the week where, or actually like a couple days of the week, and I would alternate bi-weekly what day, where it would be. But like I had people mostly in Western Burlington County, which is near Philadelphia. And then I had people in Eastern Burlington County, which is near the ocean.
Mhm.
And so like once a week, I would do like where I would be in the area.
Mhm.
And if any of I hate to say stragglers, but the folks that I was always chasing down, hey, if you'd like to meet with me, I'm going to be here. Almost like open office hours when you're
Right.
talking about like academia.
Mhm.
And sometimes I would have people come around and stop in, right? And I would just be in an area
Mhm.
for like an hour or so. And sometimes I identified people who could utilize our services. So like it was helpful, but that was something I did. Like, you may not be there when we agreed that you were going to be there and we were going to meet, but just to let you know, I'm still available on such and such day, right? Just trying to create that trust and that rapport. Let's see what we have here. Denise says that she gives clients options for communication and scheduling and asks them what methods works for them. Right. Some people may want to text you, right? And, so like, I know like we have to be aware of HIPAA and all that fun stuff, but some folks preferred to be texted. Some folks I had folks who wanted us to email them. And so we were very conscientious of what was put in the email. Obviously no PHI or anything like that, but it made them comfortable to be able to do that and to know I can email Emily at 1:00 in the morning because I'm really stressed out. I don't need her right now, but I want to be able to express myself in the moment. Right. And that we found that to be helpful.
Mhm. And I appreciate, Denise, that you're mentioning the method,
Yeah.
right? Because the method is what's key here, right? Because you do want to make sure that, maybe the communication plan is just about you being at, the Starbucks on such and such street, around 2:30 on a Tuesday, because that's when the person's getting off of their shift there. Right. So just being mindful about what's going to work best for the person, and as much as you can to your schedule, right? Because we also understand you're seeing a million consumers, right? There's a million people that are on your caseload. I'm not even trying to exaggerate. I know it's a lot of people.
Literally a million.
Right, literally. So, you want to be as accommodating as you can, because I think that can break down some of these barriers. but it's as much as you can, because you also don't want to overwhelm or put more stress or anxiety on you because you're trying to be in 15 places at once, right? It's all about that balance. And then, because we don't have a lot of time left, Dawn, we just wanted to think a little bit about considering long-term goals when you're developing goals, because we've heard this a couple of times in past webinars that we've done, that sometimes people get to this point where they've managed their mental health condition, right? It's managed, it's being managed. It's not gone. They're still experiencing symptoms, but they know how to manage their symptoms. They're in stable housing. They've been in stable housing for a year, 2 years, what have you, right? So now what? Now what happens for the person, right? So our question, and this will be a hypothetical question because I do want to get through the rest of the slides that I have, but how might you ask questions to service recipients to help them identify long-term rehabilitation goals, right? Because a lot of the times when we're thinking about when somebody comes out of the hospital or somebody comes from being unhoused into an apartment, they're just talking about and thinking about really those short-term goals of, I need to stay in my apartment, I need to get a psychiatrist, I need to get a doctor, I need to get my medical stuff situated, I need to get my mental health situated, right? So you're thinking about all of these goals that are really going to ideally be achieved and worked on within like the first 6 months to a year of them being in your program. But if once the person becomes more stable, a year, 2 years later, now what? Right? And these are some different areas to just kind of consider when thinking about some of these long-term goals. And I understand that some people, they don't want to think about the future right now. They just want to live in their apartment and they want to become stable with their mental health. And that's okay. You want to respect that. But in order for you to continue to provide services to them, right, there could potentially be some other areas you could potentially help them with. So really thinking about recovery, thinking about their quality of life, thinking about communication and oh my gosh, community integration, employment, some of these other valued life role areas, right? And thinking about what they want, right? Do they want to reconnect with friends or family members? Do they want to get a job? Do they want to, attend community functions within their neighborhood or within their larger community, right? What does quality of life look for them? What does that look like? What does community integration look like to them? Were you going to say something, Dawn?
Mm-mm.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to skip over this question because I want to get to this idea of readiness to change. Okay. So a lot of what we're going to be working on, or what you are working on with individuals, is goals, right? But most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, when you're working on a goal, something's got to change. Something is going to be changing for the person, right? So in order for change to occur, there has to be this idea of readiness, right? Readiness to change unproductive or unhealthy behaviors, and it can vary, right? It can definitely be different from one person to the next, right? So maybe it's a change that you're not thinking about making. Maybe it's a change that you are ready to make, but not now, right? And this is where that ambivalence comes in, right? I want to make this change. I don't want to make this change. I think I want to make this change. I don't think I'm ready to make this change. Maybe in 6 months I'll make this change. No, it really needs to be now, right? All this back and forth. And this is when it's really important to recognize the stages of change, right? So really figuring out what stage of change the person is in, whether that be pre-contemplation, whether that be action, or whether that be maintenance, right? So I'm not going to ask this question. What I'm going to say, though, to answer this question is the stages of change are going to impact how you provide services, because you want to make sure that the services you're providing or the interventions you're providing are in alignment with the person's stage of change. So what does that mean? So when you have somebody who's in a pre-contemplation stage of change, this is when they're at the point where they're not seeing the problem behavior or they're not considering change. So at this point, you should really only be doing outreach and support, and maybe if the person is using substances, some harm reduction. However, and I see this a lot in New Jersey, a lot of the service plans that I see individuals developing for the individuals that they're working with include skill building, right? So teaching the person skills and using some of these cognitive behavior strategies. The crux of that, though, is that those interventions are for somebody who's in an action stage of change, right? Because they're ready to make that change. They want to act on it. They want to move forward. They want to start living these new behaviors, right? So it's very important to just be mindful of the person's stage of change for the goal that they're working on, and making sure that the interventions are in alignment with that. And remembering that I know that stages of change are typically thought of around using substances and having somebody, get sober, but stages of change can be used for any goal. Any goal that the person is working on, they're going to be in a stage of change. And it's important to make sure you understand the stage of change for each individual goal as well. Did you want to add anything, Dawn? No. All right. So we have about 5 minutes left. I did want to leave some time for questions. I know some people have had to hop off, but does anybody have any questions about anything we talked about today? You're very welcome, Kelsey.
Bye. There's a lot of skedaddling. We know you guys
Yes.
totally understand.
Well, and this is all I got. So if there are no other questions, please feel free to leave. We know that you guys have other appointments. Skedaddle. I love that. I didn't know that's how you spelt it though, Kelsey. So I appreciate you spelling that out for me. I had no idea. Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. Actually, one more slide. So thank you all. We do appreciate your time, attention, and participation. So today's webinar was hosted by DBHR through the Washington Healthcare Authority. We do want to remind you that the slides and the link to the recording of the session, as well as all the other resources, are going to be available in the follow-up email. And don't forget to check out the FCS newsletter for all things FCS. And we hope to see you guys in the future. Thank you so much. Yeah, don't tell New Jersey.
Bye, y'all.
You want me to stop the recording, Dawn?